Blood is thicker than water, but it's also the ultimate tracking device in the underworld. When a 250-pound, exhausted waitress offered her arm to save a dying stranger in a frantic ER, she thought she was doing a good deed. She didn't know she was signing a marriage contract with Chicago's most lethal predator. Beatrice Halloway's feet were screaming. At 28 years old and hovering right around 250 pounds, Bea was a woman who took up space in a world that constantly asked her to shrink. She was soft curves, thick thighs, and a generous belly, all currently encased in a faded pink polyester uniform that smelled permanently of stale coffee and fryer grease. Working the graveyard shift at Rosie's 24/7 diner on Chicago's South Side meant she spent 8 hours a night carrying trays laden with meatloaf and heavy ceramic mugs, punishing her arches inside her scuffed orthopedic shoes. But at 2:15 a.m. on a stormy Tuesday, Bea wasn't at the diner. She was sitting in the harsh, flickering fluorescent purgatory of St. Jude's Medical Center's emergency room. Her roommate, Sarah Jenkins, had slipped on the wet kitchen floor of their cramped apartment and sent her hand straight through a glass pitcher. Sarah was currently behind the curtain, getting 12 stitches, leaving Bea to fight off sleep in a plastic chair that dug uncomfortably into her wide hips. That was when the heavy double doors of the ER blew open. The chaos was instantaneous. The metallic scent of copper and rain flooded the waiting room. 3 men in ruined, bespoke suits barged in, carrying a fourth between them. The man in the center was losing blood at a catastrophic rate, his white dress shirt completely saturated in a horrifying, sticky crimson. "We need a doctor, now!" roared the tallest of the men, a giant with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He wasn't asking. He was commanding. The unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster was visible beneath his tailored jacket. Nurses scrambled. Dr. Harrison Reed, a weary veteran of the night shift, sprinted forward with a gurney. They hoisted the bleeding man onto it. As he passed Bea, a heavy, blood-soaked arm slipped off the edge of the mattress. She caught a glimpse of his face. He was strikingly handsome in a severe, aristocratic way. Sharp jaw, jet-black hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, and a brutal, magnificent profile. Even unconscious and dying, he radiated a terrifying gravity. 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, 1 to the lateral abdomen, Dr. Reed shouted as they pushed through the trauma bay doors. "He's in hypovolemic shock. Type and cross him so now." Bea stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs, clutching her purse to her chest. Through the small window of the trauma doors, she could see the frantic movements of the staff. 10 minutes later, a nurse sprinted out, her face pale, grabbing a landline at the front desk. "What do you mean the blood bank is empty? I know there was a multi-car pileup on I-90, but we need O-negative right now. We are losing a patient." The nurse slammed the phone down, burying her face in her hands. The scarred giant who had carried the man in slammed his fist against the reinforced glass of the reception window, spider-webbing the pane. "Find the blood. If he dies, this entire hospital burns to the ground." The receptionist was weeping. The security guards were frozen, clearly recognizing that these were not men you approached with a taser. It was the Italian syndicate, the Castiglione family. Bea didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences or consider the violent, terrifying men tearing the lobby apart. She only heard that a man was bleeding out, and the hospital was out of the one thing that could save him. She walked up to the panicked nurse, her heavy footsteps steady. "Excuse me," Bea said, her voice surprisingly calm over the shouting. "I'm O-negative, CMV negative too. I'm a universal donor." The giant spun around, his dark eyes locking onto B. For a second, he looked at her. Really looked at her, taking in her messy brown bun, her flushed, chubby cheeks, and her stained waitress uniform. "You?" the man growled, stepping into her space, towering over her. "You would do this?" "I donate every 8 weeks, B said, lifting her chin, refusing to be intimidated, though her hands were shaking. "If you want him to live, tell them to hook me up. Within 3 minutes." Bihan was lying on a cot in a sterile room adjacent to the trauma bay. A large-gauge needle was slid into the crook of her elbow. She watched the dark red tubing fill, her life force being siphoned directly into medical bags to be rushed next door. The scarred man, whose name she learned was Alessio, stood in the corner of her room, watching her with an unreadable, intense expression. They took 2 full pints. It was technically over the standard donation limit, and by the time they pulled the needle out, the room was spinning. B felt cold, her limbs heavy and lethargic. "He's stabilized," Dr. Reed said, stepping into her room, wiping sweat from his brow. "The transfusions gave us enough time to patch the arteries. You saved his life, Miss Halloway." Alessio stepped forward. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. He dropped it on the rolling tray next to her. "For your trouble." B looked at the money, then up at the gangster. Despite her aching feet, her overdue electric bill, and the sheer exhaustion of living paycheck to paycheck, a spark of indignation flared in her chest. "I didn't sell my blood," B said softly, pressing a cotton ball to her arm and sitting up. The room tilted, but she forced herself steady. "I gave it. Keep your money." She grabbed her purse, found Sarah, who was heavily bandaged and high on painkillers, and called a cab. She didn't look back at the trauma bay. She didn't want to know the name of the man she had saved. She just wanted to go home, eat a sleeve of saltines, and sleep for a week. 3 weeks passed. The memory of the bloody ER faded into the exhausting rhythm of B's daily grind. She was back to pouring bottomless coffees, wiping down sticky vinyl tables, and smiling politely at truckers who called her sweetheart while leaving meager $2 tips. It was a quiet Thursday evening at Rosie's. Rain lashed against the large front windows, distorting the neon glow of the diner's sign. B was leaning against the counter, her stomach pressing softly against the formica edge, chewing on a fry and watching the storm. Headlights cut through the gloom. 3 sleek black Lincoln Navigators pulled into the empty parking lot, moving with militaristic precision. The hair on the back of B's neck stood up. 5 men stepped out. They were dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits that had no business being in a diner that smelled of cheap bacon. They moved purposefully, spreading out. 2 stood by the front door, flipping the open sign to closed and locking the deadbolt. 1 stood by the kitchen door. The remaining 2 walked toward the counter. One of them was Alessio. The other man walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. As he stepped into the light, B stopped chewing. It was the man from the stretcher. He was fully awake now and terrifyingly vital. He wore a charcoal Brioni suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders. His dark hair was slicked back, and his piercing obsidian eyes swept the diner before locking onto her. There was a predatory grace to his movements, even with the cane. He didn't look like a man who had nearly bled to death a few weeks ago. He looked like a king assessing his domain. He walked straight to the counter and slid into a booth in B's section. Alessio stood at a respectful distance. Bea swallowed hard, grabbed her coffee pot and a clean mug, and walked over. her thick thighs brushed together under her uniform skirt. She felt hyper-aware of her size, of the grease in her hair, of how incredibly out of place this man looked, sitting on cracked red vinyl. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Black," he replied. His voice was a deep, raspy baritone that sent a strange shiver down her spine. It sounded like gravel wrapped in velvet. She poured the coffee. Her hand trembled, spilling a drop on the table. She quickly wiped it up with her rag. "I'm sorry. We're actually... well, your men just locked the door. But we're technically open if you want to order food." "I am not here for the food, Beatrice," he said. Hearing her name in his mouth made her freeze. She clutched the coffee pot to her chest. "How do you know my name?" "I know everything about you," he said, taking a slow sip of the scalding coffee without flinching. "Beatrice Halloway, 28. You live at 412 West Elm, apartment 3B. You share it with a Sarah Jenkins. You work 50 hours a week here, and 3 weeks ago you gave 2 pints of your O-negative blood to a dying man without asking for a dime." B took a step back, her heart hammering. "Look, Mr. Lorenzo," he interrupted smoothly. "Lorenzo Castiglione." The name dropped like an anvil between them. Even Bea, who purposefully avoided the local news, knew the Castiglione family. They owned the ports, the unions, and half the politicians in Chicago. "Okay, Mr. Castiglione," B breathed, her chest rising and falling heavily. "I'm glad you're feeling better, but you don't owe me anything. Your man already tried to pay me, and I refused. We're square." Lorenzo let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Square? Beatrice, in my world, blood is the ultimate currency. You gave me your life force. My heart is beating right now because your blood is pumping through my veins. A debt like that cannot be paid with a stack of hundreds." He leaned forward, resting his large, ringed hands on the table. His gaze dropped momentarily to her waist, taking in her plush curves, before rising back to her eyes. There was no disgust in his look. In fact, there was a dark, possessive heat that made B's breath hitch. "But that is not why I am here," Lorenzo continued, his tone turning deadly serious. "I am here because my enemies, the Moretti Syndicate, found out what happened at St. Jude's. They found out a civilian saved my life, and they believe that striking you will send a message to me." B felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" No, I'm just a waitress. I have nothing to do with your mob war." "They don't care," Alessio spoke up from the shadows. "Tonight," Lorenzo said, his eyes never leaving hers, "a man broke into your apartment. My men intercepted him. Sarah was not home, thankfully. But they are actively hunting you, Beatrice." Tears pricked B's eyes. The diner began to spin, much like it had the night she donated the blood. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "What do I do? Should I call the police?" Lorenzo scoffed softly. "The police cannot protect you from the Morettis. I can." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He placed it on the Formica table and flipped it open. Inside rested a diamond ring, so massive and brilliant it looked fake. It was a square-cut rock surrounded by a halo of sapphires. Bee stared at it, her mind short-circuiting. "What is that?" "It is a shield," Lorenzo said simply. "The Morettis will kill a waitress who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But they will not dare touch the fiancée of the head of the Castiglione family. Doing so would spark a war that would wipe them off the map. As my future wife, you fall under my absolute protection." "Your wife?" Bee gasped, taking another step back. You're insane. I don't know you. Look at me, I'm a fat waitress from the South Side. Nobody is going to believe I'm marrying a mafia boss." Lorenzo stood up. He stepped into her space, moving with a predator's grace, ignoring his cane. He was a full foot taller than her. He reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently cupping her jaw, tilting her face up to meet his intense gaze. "They will believe it," Lorenzo whispered, his thumb brushing against her lower lip. "Because I will make them believe it. You think your size makes you invisible, Beatrice. But to me, you are the only real thing in a city full of ghosts. Pack your things. You belong to me now." The transition from a cramped third-floor walk-up in the South Side to a sprawling 22-room fortress in Lake Forest gave B a severe case of emotional whiplash. Lorenzo Castiglione did not do things in half measures. By the time the sun rose on Friday, Beatrice Halloway had been relocated. Her meager belongings were packed by silent, efficient men in suits, and her roommate, Sarah, was quietly moved to a secure, paid-for condo in Denver under the guise of an extended luxury vacation. B's new reality was a master suite larger than Rosie's diner. The wardrobe had been miraculously stocked overnight with custom-tailored clothing. There were no generic, tent-like, plus-size garments. Instead, she found racks of rich cashmere sweaters, silk wrap dresses that accentuated her waist, and tailored trousers that accommodated her thick thighs without pinching. Everything was designed to frame her body, not hide it. Despite the silk sheets and personal chefs, Bio felt like a hostage. A well-fed, beautifully dressed hostage, but a captive nonetheless. 3 days into her stay, she found Lorenzo in his mahogany-paneled study. He was standing by the window, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, looking out over the manicured lawns that rolled down toward Lake Michigan. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal dark, intricate tattoos sprawling across his forearms. "I'm going crazy," Bea announced, standing in the doorway, crossing her arms over her chest. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress that hugged her heavy curves, a color Lorenzo had personally requested she wear. He turned, his obsidian eyes sweeping over her. A flicker of genuine hunger flashed in his gaze before he masked it with his usual stoic composure. "You look beautiful, Beatrice. Has the chef not accommodated your preferences?" "The food is fine, Lorenzo, but I am not a porcelain doll," she snapped, stepping into the room. "I'm used to working. I'm used to being on my feet. Sitting around this mansion waiting for invisible assassins to strike is driving me out of my mind." Lorenzo set his glass down. He walked toward her, the slight limp from his recent brush with death still present but barely noticeable. He stopped mere inches from her. She had to tilt her head up to meet his eyes. "You are restless," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet room. "I understand. But the threat is real. Vincent Moretti does not forgive easily. He lost territory to me last month, and finding out a civilian waitress saved my life, wounded his pride. In our world, wounded pride leads to spilled blood." "So what? I stay locked in this house forever as your fake fiancé?" "Not fake," Lorenzo corrected smoothly, lifting a hand to tuck a stray strand of brown hair behind her ear. His knuckles brushed her soft, plush cheek. "Tomorrow night, the Chicago syndicate heads are gathering at the Drake Hotel for the annual Gold Coast Charity Gala. I am introducing you to society. Once they see you on my arm, wearing my ring, the protection is absolute." B's stomach dropped. "A gala? Lorenzo, those women are all 0% body fat, dripping in old money. I'm 250 pounds of diner waitress. They're going to eat me alive." Lorenzo's expression hardened. He gripped her waist, his large hands easily spanning the curve of her hips, pulling her flush against his solid chest. The heat radiating from him was intoxicating. "Let them try," he growled. "You are more woman than any of those starving socialites. You saved a life while they count calories. When you walk into that room, you will not shrink yourself. You will hold your head high because you belong to a king. Understand?" Bee swallowed the lump in her throat, her pulse hammering against her collarbone. "Okay." The next evening, Bea stood before a full-length mirror, breathless. Lorenzo's tailor had created a masterpiece, a sweeping, emerald-green velvet gown with a plunging neckline that showcased her generous cleavage, cinched at the waist before flowing elegantly over her wide hips. Her hair was swept up into an intricate twist, and the sapphire engagement ring felt heavy and cold on her finger. When she walked down the grand staircase, Lorenzo was waiting in a bespoke tuxedo. For a moment, the dangerous mafia boss looked entirely breathless. He offered his arm, his eyes dark with unspoken promises. "You look like a queen." The Drake Hotel ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and dangerous men hiding behind polite smiles. The moment Lorenzo and Bea entered, the ambient chatter died. Hundreds of eyes locked onto them. Bea felt a wave of anxiety, instinctively wanting to cross her arms to hide her stomach. But Lorenzo squeezed her hand, a silent command. She squared her shoulders and walked tall. For the first hour, it was surprisingly civil. Lorenzo introduced her to politicians, judges, and union bosses. But the tension in the room spiked when a tall, painfully thin man with a hooked nose and slicked-back grey hair approached them. "Lorenzo," the man purred. "Vincent," Lorenzo replied, his voice dropping an octave. Vincent Moretti's cold, reptilian eyes slid over Bea, lingering on her waistline with obvious disdain. "I heard a rumor you were settling down, Castiglione, but I must admit, I expected someone a bit more refined, or at least someone who pushes away from the table." A collective gasp rippled through the immediate bystanders. Bee's face burned hot with shame. But before she could retreat, Lorenzo moved. Quicker than lightning, he grabbed Vincent by the throat, slamming the older boss back onto a lavishly set banquet table. Crystal shattered. Women screamed. "Listen to me very carefully, Vincent," Lorenzo hissed, pressing his forearm against Moretti's windpipe. "This woman's blood is the reason I am breathing. She is my bride. If you so much as look at her with disrespect again, I will cut out your eyes and feed them to the stray dogs in the South Side. Am I clear?" Vincent choked, nodding frantically. Lorenzo released him, smoothing his own tuxedo jacket as if nothing had happened. He turned back to Bee, offering his arm. "Shall we get some air, my love?" As they walked out to the terrace, Bee's heart was pounding. Nobody had ever defended her like that. Nobody had ever made her feel so profoundly valued. The line between their fake engagement and her very real, terrifying feelings was blurring rapidly. But out in the cool Chicago night air, the real twist was waiting. The gala ended early due to the altercation. Lorenzo and Bea were escorted to the underground parking garage by Arthur, Lorenzo's head of security. Arthur was a quiet, unassuming man who had worked for the Castiglione family for 15 years. As they approached the armored Lincoln, Arthur unlocked the doors. But instead of opening the rear door for them, he stepped back, his hand hovering over his earpiece. "Arthur, what are you doing?" Lorenzo asked, his eyes narrowing. "I'm sorry, boss," Arthur whispered, pulling his firearm. Vincent made me an offer I couldn't refuse." Before Arthur could raise the gun, Lorenzo pushed Bea behind the massive concrete pillar of the parking garage and drew his own weapon. Gunfire erupted in the echoing concrete cavern. 2 black SUVs suddenly screeched around the corner, blocking the exit. 6 of Vincent Moretti's men piled out, armed with automatic weapons. "Stay down!" Lorenzo roared over the deafening sound of bullets pinging off the armored Lincoln. He returned fire, dropping one of the advancing thugs. Bea was pressed against the cold, grimy concrete, her beautiful emerald dress collecting dust. Panic seized her throat. They were pinned down. Lorenzo only had a handgun, and the men advancing on them had heavy firepower. Worse, Lorenzo's leg was bleeding. A stray bullet had grazed his thigh, aggravating his previous injuries. He stumbled, falling behind the bumper of the car. The Moretti men were closing in, reloading their weapons. Arthur was flanking them from the right. Bea's diner instincts kicked in. At Rosie's, when a drunken brawl broke out, you didn't cower. You grabbed the nearest heavy object. She wasn't a delicate flower, and she refused to let the man who had just defended her honor die on a dirty garage floor. Spotting a red emergency fire extinguisher mounted on the pillar just above her head, Bea ripped it from its bracket. It weighed a solid 20 pounds, but she hoisted it easily. As Arthur crept around the pillar, his gun trained on the spot where Lorenzo lay. Bea stepped out. With a fierce, guttural yell, she swung the heavy metal cylinder with all her might. It connected with Arthur's jaw with a sickening crunch. The traitor went down instantly, his gun clattering across the pavement. Bea didn't stop. She pulled the pin on the extinguisher and squeezed the handle, spraying a massive, blinding white cloud of chemical foam directly into the faces of the advancing Moretti gunmen. The diversion was all Lorenzo needed. With the enemy blinded and coughing wildly in the thick chemical smoke, Lorenzo pushed himself up over the hood of the car, firing with lethal, practiced precision. 3 rapid shots, 3 bodies hitting the floor. The remaining 2 gunmen panicked, blindly scrambling back into their SUV and peeling out of the garage, the tires screaming in terror. Silence fell over the garage, save for the hiss of the empty fire extinguisher in Bea's hands. She dropped it, her chest heaving, the adrenaline draining from her system and leaving her violently shaking. She looked down at Arthur's unconscious body, then at Lorenzo. Lorenzo was leaning heavily against the car, blood seeping through his tuxedo trousers. But his dark eyes were fixed on Bea. He wasn't looking at her with fear or shock. He was looking at her with absolute, unwavering awe. You okay?" Bea stammered, rushing to his side, tearing a strip of expensive silk from the underskirt of her gown to tie a makeshift tourniquet around his leg. "I have survived assassins, rival families, and the FBI," Lorenzo breathed, catching her hands, stopping her frantic movements. He pulled her up so they were face to face. "But I have never seen anything as magnificent as you swinging that fire extinguisher, Beatrice." Tears finally spilled over her cheeks, cutting tracks through her makeup. "I couldn't let them kill you. I already gave you my blood once. I wasn't about to let it spill on this floor." Lorenzo reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out the velvet box containing the sapphire ring. He had taken it off her finger before the gala started, insisting on cleaning it so it would catch the chandelier light perfectly, and had slipped it in his pocket during the chaos. Despite his bleeding leg, Lorenzo Castiglione lowered himself onto one knee on the oil-stained concrete. "Lorenzo, what are you doing? You're bleeding," she cried, trying to pull him up. "I am securing my future," he said, his gravelly voice echoing with solemnity. I brought you into my home to protect you. I put a ring on your finger to ward off my enemies. It was a transaction. But Beatrice, you are not a transaction to me. You are fierce, you are loyal, and you possess a beauty that eclipses every woman I have ever known. You don't just own my blood, you own my soul." He held up the ring. "This is no longer a shield," Lorenzo said, looking up at her with raw, unfiltered devotion. "This is a promise. Marry me, Beatrice. Not for protection, not for a debt. Marry me because I cannot imagine ruling this empire without my queen." Bea looked down at the lethal Mafia Boss kneeling at her feet. She thought about her cramped apartment, her aching feet at the diner, and the years she had spent feeling invisible. Then she looked at the man who saw her, truly saw every inch of her, and deemed her a goddess. A watery smile broke across her face. "On one condition," she sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Anything," he vowed. "You never make me go to a high society charity gala ever again. And on Sundays we eat pancakes with extra butter." Lorenzo threw his head back and laughed, a rich, booming sound that chased the darkness from the garage. He slid the heavy sapphire back onto her finger, sealing his vow. Done. He pulled her down into his arms, kissing her with a fierce, possessive heat that promised a lifetime of chaos, passion, and unbreakable loyalty. Beatrice Halloway had walked into the hospital to save a stranger. She walked out of the shadows as the most powerful woman in Chicago. Wow, what a wild ride. If you loved Beatrice's fearless journey from a late-night diner waitress to the reigning queen of the Chicago underworld, you won't want to miss our next story. Hit that like button. Share this thrilling romance with your friends who love a fierce, curvy heroine, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heart-pounding mafia dramas and epic twists. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter.